Poetry, Love and Relationships, Porphyria's Lover, and Poems to compare it to. Before I start, I just want to say a thank you to the physics and maths tutor for allowing me to use their resource in my video. There are loads of free resources on their website, so check out the link in the description now. Let's read the poem. The rain set early in tonight. The sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite, and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with heart fit to break, when glided in Porphyria straight. She shut the cold out and the storm, and kneeled and made the cheerless grate braze up, and all the cottage warm. Which done, she rose, and from her form withdrew the dripping cloak and shawl, and laid her soiled gloves by, untied her hat, and let the damp hair fall. And last she sat down by my side and called me, when no voice replied. She put my arm around her waist, and made her smooth white shoulder bare, and all her yellow hair displaced, and, stooping, made my cheek lie there, and spread over all her yellow hair, murmuring how she loved me, she too weak for all her heart's endeavour to set its struggling passion free, from pride and vainer ties dissever, and give herself to me forever. But passion sometimes would prevail, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain a sudden thought of one so pale, for love of her and all in vain. So she was come through wind and rain. Be sure I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud. At last I knew Porphyria worshipped me. Surprise made my heart swell, and still it grew, while I debated what to do. That moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. I found a thing to do, and all her hair, in one long yellow string, I wound 3 times her little throat around, and strangled her. No pain felt she. I'm quite sure she felt no pain, as a shot bud that holds a bee. I warily opened her eyes. Again laughed the blue eyes without a stain, and I untightened next the tress about her neck. Her cheek once more blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. I propped her head up as before, only this time my shoulder bore her head, which droops upon it still. The smiling, rosy little head, so glad it has its utmost will, that all it scorned at once is fled, and I, its love, am gained instead. Porphyria's love, she guessed not how, her darling one wish would be heard, and thus we sit together now, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. So this is a very interesting poem, and a very long one at its length as well. It talks about how the disturbed speaker is in such a possessive relationship with his wife that he kills her to gain full possession, and he only seems truly happy when he has killed her and gained possession of her. So this is quite a huge power imbalance in this relationship, so that will be useful for when I tell you some good poems to compare it to, such as Farmer's Bride, later in the video. But looking at the annotations that I've received from physics and maths tutor, I suggest you take note of the most important ones, which I'll go through now. So in the beginning, early in the poem, the poet has used a lot of pathetic fallacy in the rain, the sullen wind, to vex the lake, and everything is personified in a negative portrayal, which establishes a dark and disturbing tone from early on. The use of sullen wind even shows how nature is miserable, and vexing the lake highlights how the speaker's state of mind is angry and unstable. When he talks about the entrance of his lover, he says glided, and there's a lot of supernatural connotations with glided, which imply the speaker does not view her as a person, but as something much more valuable. Now there's also notes on here that say Porphyria is a rare blood disease, but I would personally not use that in annotations, since that was actually found out after the poem was written. Now, the use of enjambment is also made clear. Just in case you don't know what enjambment is, it's when a line continues onto the next line with no punctuation towards the end. And it highlights how it's a stream of consciousness. But the fact that there's no logical format for the poem possibly parallels how the speaker's disturbed mindset is illogical and irrational, and there's no sense of logic and basic sense within what he's saying, which is why he goes and kills her towards the end. He talks a lot about her hair as damp and yellow, and then he talks about it as a rope on the next, similar to a rope when he says long yellow string. And by constantly referring to it, it sort of highlights how he's so possessive about just a single part of her. Now, constantly referring to it as yellow, it mimics how a rope is also yellow when it says long yellow string. It's an odd way to describe hair, but it also validatingly describes rope and highlights how that could also be used to kill. He talks about how she's perfectly pure and good. Now, normally this would be a positive thing in a relationship, but Browning uses plosive alliteration in perfectly pure to foreshadow the act of violence that will be committed. Since plosive alliteration is often used to create this sort of beating sound, it's a very uncomfortable sound for the listener. Once he kills her, he describes her eyes as without a stain and says the smiling rosy little head. Now, this is very interesting and highlights and probably reveals the most about the speaker's character and disturbed state of mind, because by describing her as smiling and rosy and happy, the fact that the only positive statements that are coming out of his mouth are once she's dead highlights how this is not a relationship that is normal and loving and caring, but with a huge power imbalance. Now let's look at the poet context. So it was written by Robert Browning, but don't fear, because he actually did not kill a woman. He was writing in the perspective of a fictional event, because during the time where he lived, scandals were constantly being published in the newspaper. So he tried to be transgressive and talk about those scandals within the form of fictional poetry. He was born in 1812 and died in 1889, and he did not actually, as we talked about, he didn't actually have scandals with women and didn't strangle anyone, so don't worry about that. Let's look at structure and form points that I highly recommend you take note of and use in your essays. So first of all, the poem tells a story in chronological order. The lack of stanzas suggest a passive unfurling of events, which the speaker views only as natural. This, combined with the first-person narrative, implies that the narrative is a stream of consciousness. He only used the collective pronoun we once, which suggests how disconnected they are, and it conflicts with the idea of it being a relationship poem. 3. The poem is in the form of a dramatic monologue, which highlights how there's only one person's perspective in this poem. And it's also a very ordered verse structure, which contrasts with the enjambment, and it helps to portray the speaker's intentionality behind his portrayed madness. And finally, it's written in iambic tetrameter, which is an unstressed then stressed syllable, with 4 stressed beats in one line. Now you can make of that of what you will, but let's move on now to language essay points. First of all, alliteration. So alliterative phrases are used in the poem to highlight certain phrases. We talked about plosive alliteration as well. And Browning combines alliterative W sounds with triadic structures in one wish would, which causes the listener discomfort. The constant use of alliterative phrases and uncomfortable sounds mimics the horrific content of the poem, and it highlights how it's just an uncomfortable way that she's being killed and an uncomfortable relationship in the beginning. Religious imagery is also used, and although religion is not a main theme of the poem, its underlying presence could be interpreted to represent the speaker's attempt to suppress their religious guilt, which is even shown in the final line. Porphyria's ability to shut the cold out has hubristic connotations, foreshadowing the lack of religious morality in the poem. Also, objectification is used when Browning's use of language in Porphyria's Lover demonstrates the speaker's conception of Porphyria as an object. Once she has died, he then acknowledges her blue eyes. However, the sense of lifelessness makes it seem as if he's owning a doll instead of an actual person. Now, here are two poems to compare it to. When We Two Parted and Sonnet 29. However, another good poem would be Farmer's Bride, because there is a huge sense of possessiveness. However, I did want to provide two different unique ones so that you can actually use them. So in terms of Porphyria's Lover and When We Two Parted, both poems make reference to death. However, Byron makes more implicit references, whereas Browning creates more explicit references. In terms of differences, Porphyria's Lover's speaker describes his lover's body in a way which makes her seem alive, whereas in When We Two Parted, something living is made to seem physically dead, in Pale Grew Thy Cheek. In terms of Porphyria's Lover and Sonnet 29, both speakers have an unhealthy obsession with the object of their affection. In Sonnet 29, the love is smothering and all-encompassing, and Browning's speaker is equally transfixed, and his possessiveness quickly turns nasty. In Sonnet 29, however, the speaker recognises the unhealthy nature, whereas in Porphyria's Lover, it goes on and on to the extent that she's dead, and there's no conclusive way that he realises what he's done is wrong. For more videos on GCSE English, GCSE French, GCSE Geography and GCSE Computer Science, subscribe to No Waffle GCSE. Thank you for watching till the end, and see you soon.